Oh, okay, me neither. I'm like, are you hearing anything? Are my speakers broken? Um, pause. Okay, they're figuring it out. I don't even want to hear all this stuff. I'm going to be triggered. What?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Good morning, everyone. Thank everybody for being here. We've got a really good presentation that I'm excited about. If some of you may have remembered, we did a similar one of these a couple of months ago where we looked at a private VDI solution. And today we're going to kind of complete that two-part series by introducing our guest Ryan in just a few minutes, who's going to be walking us through kind of the Microsoft's version of VDI, which is called Azure Desktop. So just before we begin, a couple of quick reminders and monitoring that. We'll do some Q&A at the end, but if there's anything that's kind of like a burning question that you'd really like us to talk about right away, don't hesitate in real time. And then we'll also be sending out a copy of this presentation afterwards. So if you want to go back and rewatch it or share it with somebody else, obviously, that'll be available to you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen once more, do a quick right, and I'll move you guys over here, and there we go. Perfect. So just a real quick overview of who Paragus is for anybody who's not familiar with our company. We've been around for about 20 years doing what we do today for probably the last 10 or so, really since about 2011. We are currently about 60 full-time employees serving about 140 businesses across Western and Central Massachusetts. Our core purpose is to try to make IT fun. And really what we mean by that is to try to make it as seamless, as easy, as scalable, as effortless as possible. Our goal is really to have technology and thrive. And that's really what we're here today to talk about. So I'm going to skip right into that, which is kind of the why are we here today? I think as we talked a little bit about during the last presentation, during COVID, we saw obviously a tremendous amount of people want to work more remotely. At the same time, we're also seeing a huge increase in businesses who want to be able to hire people from different parts of the country. They want to be able to have a workforce that's much more geographically diverse. And they're just trying to build an organization that can respond to the changes in the market, which is changing very quickly. Sometimes sales are skyrocketing, then they're slowing down. The tech sector's seen a lot of change and transition. There's so much happening that businesses need to be more robust and nimble than ever in their ability to respond to that. And part of that is how their IT infrastructure is set up. And one of the things that businesses have been turning to, especially larger companies, is this idea of virtual desktop. And the concept at a really high level is that you have a desktop that's available to you anywhere in the world, anytime, no matter where you are. And there's something very scalable and approachable about that for businesses that are facing the current challenges that we all face today. And as we presented in the last webinar, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this. We looked at a on-premise kind of local version of a virtual desktop, and we talked about some of the pros and cons of that. And today, what we're going to be doing is looking at the Microsoft equivalent of that and what it looks like to do it at that scale and that level. And what's beautiful about this solution is it works for very small businesses and it works for very large businesses. Microsoft has really designed this product in a way that is quite scalable, but not so cost expensive that it doesn't make sense for even a smaller micro business. So without further ado, I am going to officially hand things over to our guest of honor today. We have Ryan Azure Technologies for the last 10 years. He knows a lot about this space and is going to be able to walk us through the Microsoft solution, the pros and cons, and help you better understand why it might be a good use case for your screen. And Ryan, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Ryan Hughes. I'm an Azure specialist that's been working with Azure Technologies for over 10 years now. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Azure Virtual Desktop, which, as was just mentioned, is another form of virtual desktop solution that's actually fairly new to the market. It's only been around, I think we're going about 3 years now, but it's really Microsoft's response to what's an ever-growing part of the tech sector is this whole idea around cloud-based virtual desktops. So, what exactly is Azure Virtual Desktop? So again, it's Microsoft's kind of version of this whole, we hear this thing VDI or virtual desktop. And essentially there's different ways to offer it. You can do it on premises in kind of a private environment. You can have a hosted experience, or now you have an enterprise grade cloud experience. And to what Delcy was saying earlier, it's kind of interesting how this came to be, because when Microsoft actually first came out with this product, it was just before COVID happened to hit. And I'm not saying there's a coincidence there, or it was planned, but it just, the timing was unbelievable, because it was also right around that time, or not too long after, when COVID really skyrocketed this demand for going remote, right? Everyone, as I'm sure everyone remembers, trying to figure out, okay, we're quarantined. How do we get, keep businesses going? How do we allow people to still be productive and also secure at the same time, so that our businesses can move forward? Well, Azure Virtual Desktop was Microsoft's solution to this, and of course still is. It's gone through a few iterations, so it's far more robust now than even when it was first brought out. But essentially, especially for businesses that were already consuming Microsoft products like 365, this was a wonderful way to be able to offer a secure remote capability for workers to stay productive, especially when they're already consuming Microsoft Office licensing. I'll talk here in a little bit about why that is the case. But this, what made this a little bit different is your users could actually have a true Windows 10 or now even Windows 11 experience, and a lot of the benefits that come with that. Traditionally in what we call remote desktop services based environments, some may know it as terminal services, you'll still have a Windows-like environment. But Azure Virtual Desktop is a solution that came out where you would still have the look and feel of a true Windows 10 or now Windows 11 environment, but with all the benefits of those remote capabilities that we'll talk about here in just a moment. To kind of kick it off, so I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the benefits. Again, we hear this term VDI or remote work, and there's a lot of different ways. Where Azure Virtual Desktop really stands itself out is that, what I was mentioning earlier, that capability of allowing your user to have a true Windows 10 or Windows 11 experience, but in the back end, you can do it in what's called a multi-session way. And what that really means is the fact that you can utilize physical resources much more efficiently to be able to allow your users to have that experience. And what that in the end means is cost reduction. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few moments. But if you were already consuming Microsoft cloud licensing, so it would be Office 365 and now it's Microsoft 365, but it's still that cloud experience, you've already got a lot of the foundational piece where Azure Virtual Desktop was an easy add-on. And we saw this really drive demand versus trying to figure out maybe some other types of solutions that you have to do a little more work to integrate and configure. Azure Virtual Desktop is based off already the kind of identity framework. You may be familiar with Azure AD. Well, it seamlessly integrates into that, which will already exist if you're already consuming those Office licensing. And so it makes adoption right off the bat so much easier and cost effective, not to mention a lot of the other benefits we'll talk about here in a few moments. Another nice feature of Azure Virtual Desktop is that you can get it up and running very quickly versus some of the other options. So for instance, if you're looking at maybe deploying something on premises and you're going to deploy maybe a remote desktop services farm, well, there's a lot that goes into that, right? You got to plan for the physical piece. You got to plan for capital expenses. You have to do capacity planning, make sure you have enough resources available, things like that. And there's a lot more work that goes into that. When you start dealing with cloud, anything that's like cloud infrastructure, which this is based on, it takes a lot of the work out of that, because you can ebb and flow and scale as needed to fine tune when you're actually setting this up. And what that results in is a far quicker design, deployment, and optimization process, because you can do it all on the fly. You don't have to worry about ordering physical gear, physical resources, working about supply chain issues with RAM or storage, all these things that can just slow things down, which I know everyone or many have experienced, especially during COVID. And so one of the benefits of Azure Virtual Desktop is the fact that it's based on Azure infrastructure. And so when you're talking about cloud infrastructure, you log into a portal and whatever resources you need, different server types, storage, all those things, they're available right at your fingertips. And you simply, scale up, scale down, scale sideways, otherwise known as vertical and horizontal scaling. You can do these things on the fly. And so there's a huge benefit to that just from the configuration and deployment phase. When you go to actually deploy the service, now Microsoft likes to put on their marketing that you can deploy it in a matter of minutes. Well, that's true if you have a very simple, very basic type of deployment. Some deployments are more complex and they take, a little bit longer. But still, by comparison to maybe something physical on premises, far quicker deployment and optimization than maybe a physical infrastructure on premises. Again, nothing wrong with physical on premises, but these are just some of the differences that cloud infrastructure based systems like Azure Virtual Desktop will help when organizations, especially when they're trying to move on the fly and be as nimble as possible in an ever-changing environment. One of the great integrations of Azure Virtual Desktop is how Microsoft set up integration with the Office 365 product suite, as well as Teams, which comes with, really the basic licensing that you'll need anyway. So for instance, if you're an organization and you already have Microsoft 365 Business Premium, or E3 or E5, or a mixture of any of those licenses, you've actually already got all the licensing and everything you need to run Azure Virtual Desktop outside of course, the infrastructure that designed in Azure to actually run the resources. But Microsoft has put a lot of work into actually optimizing this for specific to your Azure Virtual Desktop environment. And so if you want to, deploy Office, a full Office experience, and Teams with full audio video capability, or there's even a Zoom optimization. There's also a Citrix WebEx optimization. Any of these kind of web conferencing tools in conjunction with Office experience, you can now deploy within that Azure Virtual Desktop environment. So it's living in Microsoft's data center in a highly secure data center, completely optimized, completely under your control. And your users are going to have the look and feel as if they had a local endpoint right in front of them, their laptop or desktop. They won't know the difference. As long as it's designed correctly, they won't know the difference. But yet everything is actually living in Azure. It's not actually down on their physical endpoint. And there's a lot of work that went into engineering it that way to make sure they had that experience. Because historically, with other environments, RDS, sometimes there would be some lags and latency. There would be some other issues getting, especially around audio video redirection with like WebEx tools like Teams, that sometimes it just wasn't the best experience. Azure Virtual Desktop is absolutely solved for that. Last but not least here, around some of the user benefits. If you happen to be using like a Citrix or even like a VMware Horizon type environment, and you want to continue using that, there's integrations specific for those as well on Azure Virtual Desktop. So you can still layer those tools on top of it should you choose to do so, and have those familiarity, the familiarity of the tools that you're already used to using with, but still the benefits of the Azure Virtual Desktop, platform within the Azure ecosystem. So let's talk a little bit about security. I know this is huge, it's always been huge, but I think more now than ever, we're just hearing more about it, breaches, hacks, ransomware, and it's real. I can tell you even here, we've seen some things where, some environments have been exposed and it's been, it's been very painful for both the entities involved. So it's a real concern and we understand why. There's still some thoughts out there around, hey, I'm a little bit nervous about the cloud. I'm a little bit nervous that it's not as secure. It's not here in my office. I can't feel it, touch it, all of those things. And that's understandable. What I can say about not only Azure, but Azure Virtual Desktop is, from the data center layer up, you're dealing with an enterprise solution. So even at the DC layer, data center layer at Microsoft has more compliance and security certifications than any other provider in the world. That includes AWS, that includes Google, Alibaba, a gazillion others. Microsoft is still at the forefront. Now, that doesn't automatically mean everything you deploy is 100% compliant. There's depending on what kind of compliance you need, there's a lot of other things you may need to do. But from a platform perspective, you're already good to go. What does that mean to you? Well, by way of economies of scale, even at the physical layer, you're getting all of these different things from redundant power, redundant cooling, physical security, biometric security, redundancies in networking, redundancies in internet, providers. That's all factored in. That's already at your fingertips when you're deploying solutions within these data centers. Then you move up to the actual platform that you may deploy within that ecosystem, Azure Virtual Desktop being one of them. And so when you're deploying Azure Virtual Desktop, you're deploying it in a data center that's already got all those capabilities at the physical layer. And then there's some other security pieces that have actually built into this specific platform as well. So starting off with kind of the access piece. So with Azure Virtual Desktop, first and foremost, you don't have to have any inbound ports open. So traditionally, with like a remote desktop services deployment, you're going to have an inbound port open, usually 3389. And so, normally you would run your connection, your RDP connection over a VPN just to make sure you had, security there. When Azure Virtual Desktop was designed, they removed this need. So there's no longer any inbound ports open when you deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. It's actually, when a user authenticates, it's an outbound connection, and it runs over 443, which is an encrypted, route. So it's automatically far more secure from the get-go. In addition to that, as from a usability perspective, you can actually, there's a native client for Windows, Mac, iOS, Android. There's also what they call the HTML5 web gateway, which is basically, you can authenticate from a browser, right? Going to Google, Edge, whatever, and access it from there, which allows you, another benefit to this that they didn't really put here is, let's say you have some Think clients. Let's say you have some older hardware that's, you don't really use anything, for anything else, but now you can repurpose it because you can now use that physical inventory if it fits in your business model to actually still be productive, because the virtual desktop you're accessing is just being reflected on the screen of that device, but all the computing and everything is actually happening in the Azure environment. There's also a bunch of additional security tools that have both been built in to Azure Virtual Desktop, and then there's of course some additional pieces that you can use as well. You may start to hear the term Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Microsoft Defender for Cloud has some different pieces to it, like Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Server. There's also some data protection pieces that come with some of the M365 licenses. All of this to simply say that with Azure Virtual Desktop, you can keep your company data separate from personal data. So if someone is using, if it's a BYOB, right, they bring in their own, or BYOD, excuse me, bring in their own device, or maybe they're using a company issued device, but you want to just make sure that your corporate data is secure in a remote environment. These tools make it much easier to do so. It makes it much easier to shut things down, to lock that data off, to wipe that data without wiping the full device. A lot of different security features have been enabled with this tool to really satisfy the need to keep your corporate data secure while allowing your users to be productive. And that dancing act has always been a challenge since day one. Maximizing security without minimizing productivity. And, it's never a perfect, there's no one way to do it because every organization has different needs. What I like about the different tools that they've involved here, like the Microsoft Defender products and DLP product and some other pieces that you can use, they've designed it to make it far easier to give granular controls based on a user's need and balance the company's need with keeping data secure with the user's need to be productive. And this is especially true if they're bringing their own device, which of course with Azure Virtual Desktop you can do. And then last but not least, you have what's called RBAC, or rules-based authentication. Permissions is essentially what it is. And you can actually, again, on a per user basis, provide different permissions. If you want some users to have full local admin rights to their desktop, you can absolutely do so. If you want to limit, what they can and cannot do on their desktop, just the same you can with a physical endpoint that's joined to your domain, you can absolutely do so. And you can mix and match as you need. And so all of these tools are at your fingertips within Azure Virtual Desktop. That, again, the whole thing I want to drive home is the ability to really place granular controls in your environment, yet keep your workers productive. And that's so key. And Azure Virtual Desktop has really been designed to be able to do that, because that need is so much more at the forefront of businesses requiring to be agile and secure simultaneously. And Microsoft's actually done a really good job at making this available to you. So cost. There's a couple different things with Azure Virtual Desktop that really helps to build this solution in a way that everyone can use it. Historically, I think Microsoft has kind of been more of an enterprise focused, organization, where a lot of their designs, a lot of, what they made, available for public consumption, it just tended not to be really within the grasp of a lot of SMB. And, they're just very expensive solutions, wonderful solutions, but just too expensive for everyone to really fairly be able to consume. Microsoft's really made a push in the last few years to really start developing solutions that will allow the SMB market to also gain the same benefits as everyone else. And Azure Virtual Desktop is a huge example of that. And what I mean by that, to begin with, is, without getting too into the weeds, traditionally, if you wanted to run a true Windows 10 or Windows 11 environment, before Azure Virtual Desktop, you cannot legally, per Microsoft, be able to do that and use shared resources from a licensing perspective. So you'd have, a lot of dedicated VMs, basically persistent sessions, which drives cost up. And depending on your organization and how many users, it can drive it up substantially. One of the huge design pieces of Azure Virtual Desktop was to allow the design to incorporate shared resources for multiple users to still experience a true Windows 10 or 11 desktop session, but in the background, you're actually sharing resources. Now, when I say sharing resources, you're sharing resources within your organization. You're not necessarily sharing it with a bunch of other organizations, because all the things that you do in the design to control that. But you're sharing the resources within the users you have in your organization. And what this does, especially with the fact that built into Azure Virtual Desktop, is the ability to easily scale. So for instance, you can design the solution where, let's say you have 40 users and they're concurrently working, an average of 50 hours a week. You can design the solution to scale and be maxed out, during the 40, or 50-hour work week, and then it'll scale back in during off hours. And that's one of the ways that you optimize cost. You keep costs low. In conjunction with that, because you can share the resources, now you can maximize how many users to resource, ratio you have, which also drastically reduce costs, because there's a lot of efficiencies that have been designed into this that allow more users, per unit of resource, if you will. And that just drives, the cost optimization piece. And there's a lot of other things you can do. For instance, you can set it up like, if you have some users that still need access outside of core hours, like let's say you want to be able to, for a few users to be able to log in on the weekend, you can still do that, where that user can still initiate a session outside of the core hours, and design it to spin up and then spin down, when they're done. All of this to say, this really drives costs down, especially considering the technology of access to, versus having to worry about somebody going in and turning it on or turning it off, or a lot of manual intervention. This is all based on automation built into the configuration aspect of the tool. And so it just drives, it's a great experience for your user. It's a great experience from an administration perspective. And it really, really helps to optimize the cost piece without hampering the productivity piece. And not necessarily breaking the wallet either, versus having to have something up all the time. Another big piece of Azure Virtual Desktop is you don't always actually have to give a full desktop experience. So for instance, let's say you have maybe a need where you just need one application. Like let's say you're using, QuickBooks Enterprise. and you don't want to go to the QuickBooks SaaS option. You like the enterprise, you want to deploy it, on infrastructure, but you don't want to do it on premises, you want to do it in Azure. And that's all you need. Well, you can actually do what's called remote app, where you don't even have to publish a full desktop. You could actually publish just one or a couple of applications for your users. And the benefit of this is you'd need even less resources than if you're going to publish the full desktop. So that's another nice way of being able to use the tool just, in a more specific way to your organizational needs while keeping costs down. So they've done a good job about designing in some flexibility on how you consume the tool, again, without hampering your productivity needs. Last but not least, and from a flexibility perspective, as was touched on before, we're seeing a huge, really a change in how business and employees are, interacting or engaging or even being hired, and that's really with workers. The employee market, if you will, is now really global. A lot of times it'll still be in the U.S. Sometimes it'll be employees overseas as well, or a mix. Having a virtual desktop solution based in the cloud is a great way to solve for this, because again, you can set up custom permissions based on what, even down to a per user basis. So, give users only the permissions they need, because the big thing you hear about is what they call the law of least privilege. And that's basically making sure that your users only have the privileges they need to do their role, and not necessarily more than what is needed, at least not at the time. And so with these security controls I talked about a little bit earlier, you can control, how users are and what access they have in the same environment. So for instance, maybe you'll have some remote users that are full-time. Maybe you'll have some contract workers that they only need to be there maybe for 6 months, some temp hires, things like that. Azure Virtual Desktop, the way you can configure it, it's easy to scale up and down for those things. So if you have a contract worker that's going to be there for 6 months, you can set the permissions the way you want it, add in a little bit extra resources just so they can do what they need to do. And then when they're done, scale it back in. So that way you're only incurring any additional cost while they're there. They'll have the same, experience. They'll have all that they need to be productive. You'll have all the security controls that you need in place to keep everything nice and secure. But because of the flexibility of cloud computing, you can add and delete anytime you need. In contrast, if you have a physical deployment, well, if you need to add additional resources than what you have, well, you're going to have to, it's another capital expense. And when you're done, guess what? It's still there, right? It's essentially a sunk cost at that point, unless you're going to be able to use it down the line. But even in the interim, it's still a sunk cost. So again, one of the great benefits of having a cloud infrastructure based virtual desktop solution is the fact that you can scale on demand and only use resources as needed, whether you need scale up or scale down. So your cost is fluid with your demand. Huge benefit. And that's been a huge benefit of cloud infrastructure since the get-go. But now with Azure Virtual Desktop solving for all these other issues, as well as businesses are trying to be more agile than ever, it's just huge benefit. I can't speak enough to it from a cost. Well, from a lot of perspectives, but in this case here, the cost optimization piece really makes a big difference. And that's part of why this solution is more attainable in the SMB space, because of that cost optimization capability. Another thing too, as I mentioned earlier, if you happen to already be consuming Microsoft 365 Business Premium or better, or E3 or E5, you're actually already licensed and ready to go to use Azure Virtual Desktop. The only other piece there would just be designing out the infrastructure that you would need based on whatever the requirements are for your organization. And since I'm seeing now more than ever, a lot of organizations, even in SMB, tend to have that, or if not, if let's say they have some O365, it's usually not a big deal to upgrade to those from a cost perspective. It's not usually much more. Again, it's depending on what you're consuming now. So easy kind of get up to that. Either you're already there, or it's easy to get there to be licensed for that. You don't have to worry about CALs anymore. You don't have to worry about CALs on when you're using Microsoft or Azure, I should say, using Azure infrastructure. You don't have to worry about some of the licensing things that you you do need to worry about if you have a physical environment, and then that sometimes can drive a capital expenditure there as well. So really just another benefit of being able to adopt, a virtual desktop environment, in this case, Azure Virtual Desktop, in a cloud infrastructure environment. So really, in summary, Azure Virtual Desktop is just another way to offer a virtual desktop and a true Windows 10 or Windows 11, your choice, to any user anywhere in the world, as long as they have access to an internet connection, and do so in a highly secure way. Your corporate data is secure. Your users are still productive. You have granular control on a per user basis on who can do what. There's technology built into the Azure Virtual Desktop platform that allows it to be cost optimized in a way that the SMB market can now fully capitalize on enterprise grade infrastructure and solutions, and really helps to solve for things like availability, not having to worry about power going down in your office, worrying about an internet connection going down in your office. It's as long as you have an internet connection from anywhere, when you go across the street to Starbucks and you can hop on, authenticate, and you're working. It's just an awesome way to allow your users that capability in a secure environment, be able to have flexible infrastructure costs that match demand, which keeps it cost optimized, allow you to the flexibility, for users to be employees or to be productive with you anywhere in the world, and again at enterprise scale. So with that, I've done a lot of talking. I wanted to just give a good high overview, but I like to always leave some time to answer questions, about the solution or any thoughts. Really, just want to open it up to the floor and see if there's anything I can help with.
Yeah, so Ryan, it looks like the first question here is, what exactly is the end user experience? So what is it? I think what the question is kind of like, what is it? How does it work from the end user's perspective of like what they're going to experience if there's a VDI like this in place?
Sure. So what'll happen, they'll either have an icon on their desktop, right, a native icon, depending on what platform they're using, where they'll click and, it's single sign-on with Azure AD. So they'll authenticate, and then what'll happen is their desktop will come up and it will look just like if you opened your laptop right now. Let's say you have a company issued laptop and you open it and you log on, and let's say it's Windows 11, and if you deploy the same applications as part of your Azure Virtual Desktop environment, when they log on, it's going to look exactly the same. It is a true Windows 10 or 11 experience if that's how you deploy it. So once they log on, boom, it's basically think about it as a laptop within a laptop, if you will. If they're on a physical laptop as their endpoint, it's just a separate screen that pops up. And though they're viewing the screen on their endpoint, and it looks and feels as if they're working on their endpoint, they're actually not. That all that information in that window is all coming from Azure, but the experience is going to be exactly the same. Did that help answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. And maybe just one follow-up question would be, are there certain applications like watching videos or doing a Zoom meeting or other things that don't work as well in a VDI environment like this one?
Not with Azure Virtual Desktop. And there's the reason being, and there's been some enhancements over the years. So when they first came out with it, yeah, there were some bugs, and it was definitely not perfect out the door. But they've gone through a lot of iterations over the last 3 years. And at this point, I will say absolutely. And the reason being is they put a lot of work into what's called multimedia redirection and what's called AV or audio visual redirection. And those are things that you configure as part of the actual connection. So whether you're using a native, RDP client, or whether you're using the web gateway, in the back end, your technical team, here at Paragus is going to configure that, based on what you're going to deploy, whether it be Zoom or Teams or video or multimedia, whatever that is. And as long as your user, isn't living in the middle of the Yukon with 20 megabit per second down, kind of internet connection, as long as you have, decent internet, which these days pretty much everyone does, you're gonna have a great experience. And it's because of how you configure that technology. But the technology has been enhanced in such a way where that video, what we call audio video redirection. So like this, for instance, let's say you deploy Teams as part of your Azure Virtual Desktop, and from within your Azure Virtual Desktop, let's say you're hosting a Teams meeting. Well, because of these enhancements, when you're having that Teams meeting, it's going to look and feel the same as if you did it on from your physical endpoint. Again, the key here is to make sure you have decent internet. When I say decent internet, I'd say at least 50 megabit per second down has kind of been my experience when you're doing the full audio video or video kind of streaming or things like that. It doesn't have to be that. It can technically work with less than that, but as just kind of a safety buffer, that's kind of what I've seen. But yeah, no, the technology is definitely there to give it the look and feel, even with web conferencing, even with video conferencing, of the same experience as you would have if you were doing it from your local endpoint.
Even things like using Photoshop or using an AutoCAD program, is the VDI environment able to handle some of those more processor resource intensive applications?
Thank you. They are now. So there's a special family of virtual machines in Azure called the N as in November series, and they're GPU enabled. And so what that means is with Azure Virtual Desktop, you're going to design it based on whatever the organizational needs are. So for instance, let's say organization one says, hey, all we need is, Office apps and a browser, maybe one line of business app. Okay, so I'm gonna design that based on, whatever X resources are. If someone else, another organization, org B comes and says, yeah, we have 10 users that run AutoCAD, and then we have a finance department, we have 5 users over there that run QuickBooks, and then we have maybe a customer service department, they're just running Office. Well, one of the beauties of Azure Virtual Desktop is you can create different host pools for the different resources you need. So you don't need to use heavy duty resources for everything. So like host pool A for those that are doing AutoCAD, I'm going to design that with the N as November series. And there's a bunch of different ones in there. So, I'll obviously do more discovery to find out what the requirements are for the specific application they're using and all that good stuff. And I'll design one host pool that's specific just for those GPU users. And then I will design another host pool specific to what the finance department needs. And then I'll design another host pool specific for the users that just need the Office apps. And the reason you break it out this way is, again, that's one of the other cost optimization capabilities of Azure Virtual Desktop is I can associate the needed resources only for the users that need them versus having to deploy a bunch of resources just to make sure everyone's covered. So yes, you can absolutely run CAD and CAD type, heavy, high power usage type applications on Azure Virtual Desktop. You just design it, a little bit different. There's a lot of different resources available when we architect these solutions, but it absolutely provides for that experience. A little more expensive, because when you start adding GPU and depending on what are they doing 2D or 3D and a lot of different variables. But once we solve for that, absolutely has the capability to do that. And again, the key is segmenting out what users need what to keep the cost as optimized as possible.
So I know this isn't, yeah, I definitely. I know this next question is going to be a tough one, but it's an obvious one as well, which is what is the typical cost for a small business? And I know there's a lot of variables and a lot of impact, but kind of maybe assuming the most vanilla use case possible, can you give us some sort of idea about what a business might expect to pay for this?
And I'd say, I guess if we go, and they can range all over the place. I guess if we let's say maybe take a stereotypical, maybe SMB, let's say, I don't know, 20 users, maybe 5 need QuickBooks, the rest just need Office apps, and, just a standard desktop. I can get it down to, 25, 30, maybe a user. Now that's just the Azure Virtual Desktop piece. That's not maybe some of the other, aspects of the stack that you might need. That's not services. That's not things, there's other components there, but I can say that from from the design perspective specific to Azure Virtual Desktop, the costs, you can get the costs down there. But I need to make sure that, and I'm really glad you asked that question. What I see, and I've seen it for years, there's this whole thing, physical versus cloud. Okay. And I can tell you right now, most of the time, not every time, but most of the time, physical gear on premises, unless you have a very dynamic environment where you're having to constantly add and buy more physical stuff, that may not be the case. But if you have a pretty static environment and you don't need to purchase a lot over the life of that particular deployment, infrastructure is, in the end, once you start, factoring depreciation over 3 to 5 years, from a cost perspective, is going to be cheaper. Okay, most of the time. However, when you start doing a benefit analysis of all the different things, and I've only touched on a few today, but all the different things that you get, especially by way of economies of scale, so security, physical security, redundancy, I can go on and on and on, versus on premises, cloud infrastructure has a huge more return on your investment from a value perspective if you value those things. If you're someone that's just looking for the absolute cheapest thing, if you're down for 2 days, it's not a big deal. You don't care about redundancy, you'll figure it out. Yeah, hardware is probably going to be the way to go. But if you do care about uptime, if you do care about, being able to have remote workers all over the world and have an easier time deploying, configuring, having all these security tools built into it that are easy to configure and set up, if all those different things are of value to you, well, then you start doing a total, what we call a TCO, a total cost analysis, and most of the time that cloud cost is going to be worth it because you're getting a greater return on your investment overall. But if you just start looking at the dollars and you don't factor in all the things that are coming with the dollars, some people just care about the dollar, and that's okay. Others, see the value and all the other things that come with using a cloud infrastructure like Azure.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Other questions from the audience about either the Microsoft VDI solution or just VDI in general, kind of what this technology can do and what its use case and purpose is?
Sure, this is Stephanie Lucier. I have a few questions. So as far as the cost, I don't know what you mean by 25 to 30 per user. You can get it down. Is that, I don't know what that denomination means. Is that monthly? Is that yearly?
Oh,
is it 25? Is it 25,000? Is it 2,500?
Yeah, my apologies. Yeah, no, you're great question. So with Azure is the solution itself, and you're using cloud infrastructure. The infrastructure piece is month to month. So I'm always thinking in monthly costs. So when I said the 25 to 30, I'm thinking that's monthly. Now again, that is just kind of maybe an average SMB, one line of business app kind of setup, but it's really hard. I've been able to design them cheaper than that, and then I've had others be greater than that. What I have found is the more users you tend to have, because of the economies of scale you get with the multi-session, that tends to actually drive down the per user cost, at least from the infrastructure layer. But truth be told, when we're architecting these solutions, there are a lot of variables for us to at least get a good, accurate price. So really the best way, if this is of interest at all to you, would be to work with Paragus, and we'll work together, and I will gather those requirements and happily, put together that solution so you can actually understand, okay, what would this look like for us? And then have a good conversation internally as to if it makes sense or not.
Sure. Yeah, no, that sounds good. So you've mentioned QuickBooks a few times. We use, is it compatible with QuickBooks Enterprise Desktop? So.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. And what does the ETL process look like? So converting your data, what does that process look like? We have data served on a server and various drives. How do we get it over to the cloud? What's that process like?
Yeah, so you would actually work with Paragus, and yeah, essentially from a technology perspective, it's kind of what we call a lift and shift. There's a couple different ways to do it, but we're basically would move the data up to Azure over a secure encrypted connection, and then the data would reside in the Azure ecosystem.
There's two ways we can do that. There's the kind of traditional way, which I even would now call the legacy way, which is kind of what you're describing with map drives and files and folders. Or there's what I would consider to be the more modern way, which is to migrate to something called Microsoft SharePoint and put it into SharePoint libraries and access the data that way. A lot of businesses are choosing to replace the SMB file share, which is kind of the more traditional legacy model, and move that over to looking at, is this a good time to also, if the data is still in a legacy model, to upgrade it to a more modern model, which would be the SharePoint model. And the advantage of that being it's much more integrated into the 365 stack. So if you have like the Excel app on your phone, you can access all of the Excel documents you have access to without even having to log into the VDI, because it's being served up to you through the 365 platform, as opposed to having to open up the VDI, go to the folder, browse it, find it, open it that way. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, to Ryan's point, but those are the two most common that we see.
But the VDI or the Azure VD can be accessed from any device, is that correct? Or is it not like mobile friendly devices?
Oh, any device you can, from your iPhone, from an Android phone, from a Mac laptop, a Windows laptop. You can even use thin, what we call thin clients. So, think of like basically like a tablet, right? As long as it has internet capability, you can get on a web browser, right? Like Google or Edge, you can access it. You can even now, there's even some third-party software called iGel, where you can even take you can configure an OS specific just for AVD on some older thin clients and access it that way too. So all to say, it is very mobile friendly. Absolutely.
Just keep in mind that when you're logging in, what you're loading is a desktop. And so loading a desktop on your iPhone is going to be a little, you're going to have a start button and you're going to have icons. It's going to be a very small format. It's great in a pinch if you need to do something really quick.
Right.
It's not the ideal format to read a Word document or browse an Excel. And that's where the SharePoint library can really bridge that gap, because SharePoint can serve it up to you on a 365 Word app, which is just going to load Word on your full screen on your mobile in a much more convenient way. And that's, to Ryan's point, they've designed this platform to be so interoperable with all the other Microsoft technologies that makes it really great. You can access your data 4 different ways, and you just figure out for the use case you're doing it right now, which is the best way. I need to quickly open a Word doc on my cell phone. That's one way. I want to load my desktop and go to something that's a different way, but it's all the same data that you're accessing. You just have a lot of different options to you, and you can decide what makes the most sense.
Yep. Thanks. So Ryan, when you were talking about, the experiences, for people that are on Windows 11 and or Windows 10, it's pretty seamless, same experience. So I guess, I was making assumptions on data storage. So if you're accustomed to the Windows File Explorer or, various drives, if you are on the VD or Azure VD, your experience would essentially be the same. Am I incorrect in that assumption, or is that?
You're absolutely correct.
Okay.
You can, like, if you don't go the SharePoint route, let's say you want to have, because I do know that some organizations, their users, they don't really like change, right? Like they like their setup. They don't really want to learn a new way, necessarily to access the data. You can absolutely, with Azure Virtual Desktop, design their desktop to still have map drives, right? To still have all, it's the same functionality. So if they got a mapped drive F and it takes them to a folder that contains whatever data is in there, you can absolutely configure Azure Virtual Desktop to do the exact same thing. So that way their experience is the same as it was.
Sure. So I kind of envision our office initially being, maybe more of a hybrid. As far as compliance with data, once you move to the cloud, my understanding there's different compliance requirements once certain business lines, their data is now in the cloud. Is there assistance? Does that assistance with compliance requirements come from Paragus? Does it, I guess, is there support for that?
Yeah, so the
Alright.
So I-
compliance is going to
yeah.
be Microsoft's compliance. So it's similar if you were to use like a cloud backup solution. What we would do is, let's just say you're using a cloud backup solution, and so technically your data is being stored in the cloud by that backup company. That backup company is going to have documentation for how they're compliant with the different various data compliance laws, whether it's GDPR, whether it's Massachusetts Data Privacy Law, whether it's California Privacy Act. And what they'll do is they'll produce documentation that we can share with any of your compliance bodies that says this is where our data is stored. These are how those data centers are securing and holding that data. And Microsoft would be in that same category. And really, your approach these days, most businesses are, it's a similar type thing where you already have your data in a Microsoft cloud environment and you already have some of those same compliance requirements. This just extends it. In some ways, it simplifies it though, because you don't have to explain your data in two different ways. We have this data locally, we have this data on site, we have this data in email, we have this data here. It can somehow, in some ways, it simplifies it because of how it's being secured.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on that real quick, Stephanie, Microsoft actually has an entire website that goes into, it has their SOC audit reports. It has all their attestations and all the different variables they've met to meet them. They have audit reports you can pull for all sorts of different things like their Azure infrastructure. So all of that technical documentation on, their controls and all the things that you're getting right from a compliance perspective is publicly available. But the thing about clients is, remember too, it's a shared kind of responsibility model, right? There's definitely things you need to meet from an infrastructure layer, but then sometimes just things you need to meet internally with internal controls, things of that nature. But from at least the infrastructure layer, absolutely, there is, depending on who you're using or what pieces you're using, there should absolutely, as long as they have compliance certifications, there should be a ton of documentation like Microsoft has available to you. Along with guidance, Microsoft actually has some different documents that guide you. And okay, let's say you need to be HIPAA compliant. What are some things that you should look at? And it'll be like A, B, C, D, E, like blueprints, if you will. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's actually kind of what I had in mind. And I did take a look at it, not very in depth, and it was pretty overwhelming. So that's kind of
yeah,
going with like different lines of business. Once you move to the cloud, there's different requirements. So that's where I was kind of curious about, support offerings.
Yeah, and I'll even say, take it one step further. In some ways, the cloud makes it easier to maintain some of those compliances because, for example, with FINRA, one of the things that we're often having to deal with is tracking who has accessed certain files at certain dates and times and having logs and audits of certain data being accessed on the network. On a local on-prem network with legacy file storage, that's almost impossible to do in any meaningful way. With the Microsoft platform, we can classify data. So we can say this data is confidential, this data is regulated by this body. We can tag it with different compliance requirements and then set policies and rules that say, every time this folder or file is opened, I need a log created. I need this person to be emailed to be notified that this file was just accessed. You can create very elaborate, very complex policy requirements that either are your own internal preferences or they're your response to a compliance body who wants to see a certain level of compliance auditing. And so it gives you a lot more tools in your toolbox. To your point, it can be a little overwhelming. It's a lot of tools and it's a lot of options and a lot of things. But once you navigate that or have somebody help you navigate it, the things you can do are infinitely greater than what you can do with a traditional on-prem SMB file share.
So is there support offerings per line of business compliance requirements for, cloud data storage? And does that support, like you were talking about, Delcy, like tagging things, or does that support come from Paragus? Do we seek it out from a third party? That's kind of what I was curious about.
Yeah, so it's a collaborative effort. We can set up the policies and configure the different tags, for example, but obviously it's going to be up to your team to know which data is what and to tag it appropriately. So we can help create the classifications and the policies and how you want it to work from a compliance side. And there are certain automatic compliances that can trigger based on the AI and Sharpoo and your team to tag different folders or different directories in SharePoint as this data is of this compliance level, assuming we're using SharePoint libraries, which is how we typically do these.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. We are at 11. Are there any other burning questions before we let everybody go?
Can you quickly, in less than a minute, explain the onboarding process? Like, where do you get started? Is it a discovery meeting? Is Ryan included? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think it's also a great place to end is kind of on what the next steps would be. So if this is something your organization is interested in, typically what we would do is set up an initial kind of scoping and discovery opportunity on our side where we're going to go in, take a look at the environment, figure out what are the different user use cases. Do we need any of the higher, more complex resources like the end stuff that Ryan was referring to? Are we going to need to set up a file server because we're going to do traditional legacy file to be the different components to the infrastructure? And then usually the next step is to price that, to say, okay, this is what it looks like if we were to design it. So you've got a good sense. And that's usually where we're working with Ryan on the back and to say, here's the use going to look like from a monthly standpoint. And as we've talked about, there's a million variables, turning things on and off at night, weekends. You're paying on a per resource per second basis. It is the most granular billing you could possibly can price that. Once we've got that figured out, if a user wants to move forward, usually what we build is an initial kind of test sandbox where we'll spin up maybe one VM, use it to start creating some of the use cases and show you a demo of what if that worked out before we try to scale it. And then once we've got it kind of tuned in and we've got it working the way you want it to, then it would be a matter of building it out for everybody else and then helping your users migrate. And that's going to look a lot like traditional go live where we have to cut files over, we have to make sure stop the local version, make sure we're only using the cloud version. So it looks a little bit like a traditional go live at that last stage. And the whole project looks actually a lot like a way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelsey.
Ryan, anything you want to say before we let this group get back to work?
No, just thank you for the opportunity. And like I was saying earlier, if anyone's, interested at, kind of seeing what this looks like at a little more granular level, please work with Delcy and the Paragus team, and I'll be more than happy to help.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for attending today. It was great having an opportunity to look at this as another option in a way to approach this really important problem. So if there's anything else we can do, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and great rest of your week. And Ryan, thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Ryan.
Thank you, everyone. You got it.
Bye-bye.